beginning with the national portion review of your exam review outline. Now, I would like for us to, let me lead the review, if you will. I think that that will go smoothly. And if you have a question in between, we can address it. But let's try to stay on topic, on task, because we've got a lot to go through. So looking at the national portion of the exam, when you have a question about fixtures, typically fixtures questions are either which of the following is the definition of a fixture, or which of the following is typically an example of a fixture. And remember, when we say fixture, it used to be personal property and it became a fixed to the real estate to make it part of real property. And remind yourself that if an item is a fixture, it automatically transfers with the property. I would highly recommend that you look at Form 2T, the offer to purchase and sales contract, and read over, actually it'd be very good if you'd read over the whole contract again, but I would read over the fixtures paragraph or provision and see what they've line item there, because those are examples of what fixtures are. This question, these first sections on your exam, they should be fairly straightforward questions for you. The questions that get a little more involved are the agency, actually they get more involved, the agency and the contract questions. If you get a question about fixtures in regard to a scenario, seller and buyer are under contract, and the seller says that they're gonna leave, they're gonna take a fixture. They say it, and then they accidentally forget and don't take it. Well, if it's not excluded out of the contract, well, then it's gonna be meant to stay. One other thing I just wanna bring up here. When a real estate broker lists a property and puts the property in MLS, they're putting in MLS data information. So they're filling out what we call a profile sheet, data entry. If on the MLS sheet it says refrigerator, washer and dryer stay, and that's on the MLS data sheet. If the buyer wants to write an offer and that is not added to the offer, then there are no guarantees that the refrigerator and the washer and dryer will stay. Everything needs to be fine-tuned in the offer to purchase. In other words, another way of saying this is the MLS data sheet is advertisement, and advertisements are not sales. You know, it's not, in other words, that's not contractual. When you advertise something, you're not bound to the advertisement. Does that make sense?
So if they say they're gonna take it and they forget, the day after closing they remember, can they come back and get it?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
If it's not in the real estate contract.
No, it was in the contract that they were gonna take it.
Oh, it was in the contract,
And
yeah,
they forgot.
they could. If it was in the contract, because there is a provision in the contract that says, what's that provision? Surviving the closing. There's a provision in the contract that says, let's see if we can find it. It's about contract negotiations that survive the closing. I can't remember exactly. Let's see. Survival, of course. Page 283, if you'd like to find that. Number 19, I think that would probably cover it. Maybe not exactly, but I believe it would. And the law interprets contracts looking at the intention. And if it was all documented in the contract and someone just forgot, now they wouldn't be able just to come in the house. Of course, the keys should have been turned over anyway. But yeah, if it was noted in the contract, they would have a right. Okay, let's talk about joint tenancy. Joint tenancy, tenants in common, tend to confuse students. So let's see if we can keep this simple. You've got a test question about joint tenancy, and usually the questions are about one of the owners sold their interest, or one of the owners died, or something like that. Remember, when you're tested at your state exam and in here even, you're going to be tested with right of survivorship with joint tenancy. So if you get a test question and it says A, B, and C, Mary, John, and Sam own real estate as joint tenancy, I want you to say to yourself, and that comes with right of survivorship for our exam purposes, right? And so right of survivorship means they cannot will it. We can always sell our interest, can't we? And remember in your reading, and you might want to go back and look at it, if one of those owners wants to sell their interest and the other people refuse, because remember, they're all on the same deed, and wouldn't they have to sign? If one of them would refuse, the person who wants to sell could seek partition relief through the courts, to break it up, because they do have a right to sell. If one of those persons sells their interest, think about it, visualize it, that the joint tenancy was broken. At the beginning is created, right at the beginning. And in your reading it talks about unity of time and place and title. So it's like they're purchasing it as a unit. If one breaks off, it's like that break-off point is closed up and now two own it as joint tenants. The person who comes in as a new buyer owns as tenant in common because they were not there originally. And they can't get back to the past and get on that original deed. Is everybody clear on that? So just remember, with a sale and joint tenancy, the new person gets the interest, they get that share, whatever it was, but they're now a tenant in common. The biggest issue about that is tenants in common is always willable. And if those original three had a pact with each other, they're buddies from a long time ago, and they say, we just don't want anybody else coming in and changing things around. We like it the way it is with us three. Well, then when someone sells, someone else coming in, it's not going to be joint tenancy, and they can will, which could change the whole idea of what the creation was of the ownership. If one of the joint tenants, if you wants to will their interest, everyone, that would be what we call a distractor in your test question. If it says Mary makes a will and she dies and she wanted it to go to her son, and so what happens to the ownership? Well, if it's still the original three, if Mary dies, the remaining two own the property, because right of survivorship will overrule any kind of a will. Right of survivorship. Remember when we've said this a few times along the way, the stricter of the two will rule. Right of survivorship is stricter, let's say, we can kind of remember it that way, than someone making a will. So they could go on and on about that will, everybody, and they're trying to distract you. They're trying to get your attention away from the question, really. Questions on that? Hopefully that will be straightforward, but be real careful to read because of the way we're tested, that joint tenancy is with right of survivorship for test purposes. Not frequently used in North Carolina, but probably used in other states more. Maybe other states don't have what we have, the tenants by the entirety, where the spouse is protected in North Carolina. Maybe other states don't have that, and joint tenancy might help them along those lines. I don't know for sure, but other states tend to use it. Let's talk about condominium ownership. Now, this could be a lot of interesting questions. I don't believe it will be a difficult question for you, but it could be a lot of different things. For example, what does a condominium look like? Looks like an apartment, doesn't it? Usually. Now, it doesn't have to be stacked, but it usually does look like an apartment. And they call it horizontal. They call it a horizontal type of building or ownership. Remember that when a purchaser buys a brand new condominium, that there is a 7-day right to rescind. Right of rescission means right to cancel, doesn't it?
Yes.
So on a resale, there's not that right to rescind. Condominium is one of those hybrid kinds of ownerships, because when you buy into a condo, you're buying what they call unit airspace. You don't own any exterior structure. You don't own any of the amenities, the pool, the parking, or anything like that by yourself, but you do own that as tenants in common. In other words, everybody that owns a condominium in the development owns an undivided interest of the parking, the amenities, the pool, the stairs, and that sort of thing. Oftentimes in condominium purchases, the owner of a condo might be assigned a closet, or not a closet, a storage shed, outside their condo, just for them. That would be probably pretty typical for bicycles and things like that. But they get an undivided use of the parking and the pool and the tennis if they have that. Oftentimes they have assigned parking, and that would be okay, but, because some people would take advantage, I'm sure, if they didn't. What else about condominiums? You own the unit airspace, so if you were a real estate broker getting a call to come list or speak to the seller about putting their property on the market, when you measure, you're going to measure inside walls. Sometimes we say paint to paint. And so you do not add your 6 inches exterior for condominium. Is everybody good? I would remember, because this could be a little bit different in a question, oftentimes they throw in answers that apply to another type of question. For example, in a condominium purchase, I mentioned to you that you own the common areas as tenants in common. Remind yourself that if this was a a townhouse purchase, that the common areas are owned by the homeowners association. Now, oftentimes when you get a question, it can be a straightforward question, but they're going to throw in distractors in the answer. And then if you're a little bit uncertain, the answers will mess you up more than really the question, perhaps. And everyone, when you're reading your answers, that you're going to find many times that there are 2 answers that are right, but you're tasked with choosing the best answer, maybe the more thorough answer out of the 2. That's the real challenge. I think that you can eliminate and throw 2 out of it if you studied and you're pretty on top of the topic. So townhomes are vertical typically, and townhomes, you do own the plot underneath the townhome, to infinity, and so you've got those surface and subsurface rights right there. Visualize it like it's a detached structure as far as ownership, but it happens to be attached. And so it's attached, it's a vertical description. So if I were looking at that, I would say that a condominium is a horizontal description and a townhome is a vertical description. And the real difference is, do you own the structure or not? In a townhouse, if you can't measure the townhouse from the exterior, you would add 6 inches to the exterior walls, because you do own the structure. And the homeowners association owns the common areas, and the homeowners association would be a separate entity that way. Now, of course, everyone would be a member and pay dues. Alrighty, let's go to Unit 3. Unit 3 is about encumbrances. Unit 3, we're going to talk about liens, etc. Liens and special assessments and taxation. So, lien priority in North Carolina is based on pure race statute. In other words, race, if you will, to the courthouse to record to protect your interests. Race to the courthouse, now it'll be the attorney who will race to the courthouse and record your interest to protect you. Protect you from what?
Third parties.
Third-party interference. So everyone, that's the way you may see a question. We record because we're a pure race state, and we record because of the Connor Act in North Carolina. And we record to protect us from third-party interference. Someone else coming back and interfering with your enjoyment or your ownership. So we could also say we record to give third-party notice. That's another way. We could also say recording is called constructive notice, couldn't we? Okay, constructive notice. So lien priority would be recordation typically, but there's always a lien that's priority over anything else, and what would that be?
Property taxes.
Did you say payroll tax? Feels like payroll tax. Property tax, real estate property tax would be the priority in North Carolina if you haven't paid the tax bill. So let's remember that the priority date is January 1. If you didn't pay your real estate property tax, it will become a lien effective January 1. Now, let's remind ourselves about that timeline just for a minute, not to confuse you, but just to remind you. Taxes have to be assessed, remember, no later than 8 years, could be done every 4 years. That's in regard to the Machinery Act. So the assessment is done. Every year, the municipality, the county, the city looks at what their future budget's gonna be for next year. So they need to decide if their budget and the taxes coming in will line up. They may have to look at the tax rate. The fiscal year for taxation, just like your license year, is July 1 to June 30th. So oftentimes in an area, you will hear the discussion about budget and taxation and all of that in the spring of the year, because the city, the commissioners, you know, whoever's making that decision needs to make the decision before the end of June, because if they're changing the tax rate, it would have to be effective July 1. Remind yourself that the tax rate is a local decision. The tax rate is not under the Machinery Act. The Machinery Act in North Carolina is about standards for taxation. It's not the tax rate. The tax rate is budgetary, you know, for the locale. So when they decide on what the tax rate's gonna be, or maybe there's no change, the tax bills will be sent out in August. Taxes are due September 1. Now, I don't know how many people pay their taxes September 1, but when the bill comes out, they do give a discount, a real slight discount, if you pay your tax September 1. Taxes really are not late though, are they, until the next year, January 5th. So we said that the tax bill will become a lien if it's not paid by, if you don't pay your taxes by January the 5th, that it will be a lien. It's kind of retroactive back to January 1. Does that make sense? So you've got until January 5th of the next year before they're considered late. And if they don't get paid, this tax lien enjoys priority. It's a superior lien, and it will be effective January 1. Okay?
But it's still a lien midnight of January 1.
No, it's not a lien midnight of January 1, because you've got until January 5th to pay it, right? It becomes a lien if it's not paid. It becomes a lien if it's not paid. So if you've got that kind of a grace period until January 5th, then if it's not paid after that, then it will become a lien and it's a retroactive recording January 1. Most people pay their taxes somewhere, I would imagine, in that calendar year anyway, because remember, real estate property taxes are tax deductible in the year that you file your income tax. Special assessments, I would remember a special assessment is a one-time improvement tax. An improvement tax, meaning the idea is probably gonna improve your property value, like sidewalks in front of your property, street lighting, and that sort of thing, water and sewer. So the people that will get the benefit of that, the owners who get the benefit of that, will be assessed, it will be prorated, the expense of it, so each owner would pay their share. It's a one-time improvement tax. Special assessments do enjoy priority too. They'll never get in front of the real estate property tax, but they're right up there underneath that. So I would remember, and on a test question, they might just ask you about when it would become a lien, its priority, it never gets in front of property tax, but since it's a form of a property tax, it's gonna be underneath real property tax. And it's a one-time improvement, and what that means is, in case you're asked for an example, then it's gonna be like lighting, city and water and sewage, sidewalks, things like that. Special assessment. Tax rates in North Carolina are expressed for every $100. So a tax rate, for example, if you call the tax department, they may say, for example, the tax rate is $1.50 per $100 of value. The value they're speaking of is called assessed value. And the per $100, remember in class we said, for math purposes, putting that in the calculator, we could hit the percent key because per 100 means percent. And it is a rate, and when we speak of rates, we know we're speaking of percentages. There are other states that tax on the meal. A meal means for every $1,000. So it would, if you're working in your calculator, per 100 would be moving your decimal 2 places to the left because you're dividing by 100. Per meal, you would be dividing by 1,000 and moving your decimal 3 places to the left. Or divide the tax value by 1,000 and multiply by the number they gave you for the meal. If it's per 100, you could divide your tax value by 100 and then multiply it by the dollar and change or whatever they said that was. Questions on these first 2 units? Let's look at unit 4 then. Only a couple of questions, and you've got one about the rectangular survey, governmental survey method. That's a legal description devised many years ago in the 1800s. North Carolina doesn't use it. States west of the Mississippi do. The land is, if you view outside of if you view out your plane window, it's gonna look really and truly like rectangular plots. Rectangles, they are divided into what they call sections. Remember that each township has 36 sections, and each section is 1 mile by 1 mile. We could even say 1 mile square. Remember the distance of a mile. I would make sure I would write that down. You might need it later on for math. You're not going to need it for this, but it's 5,280 feet linear. So we did the math in class, and if we multiply that out and divide it by the square footage in an acre, 43,560, then we know that it's 640 acres. But we also know we can memorize that, can't we? So each section has 460 acres.
640.
Oh, 640. Did I say it backwards? 640. Oh dear. Maybe we do need to do the math. 640. Thank you very much, Jessica. All right, let's talk about land measurements. Everyone, these are not math questions, but you do have to know the workings of how to get acreage. If you were looking at an area, if they gave you a lot size, we know to get the area, we multiply the front times the depth. And then if they're saying how many acres are in there, we divide by 43,560. Oftentimes these, in your math question, they might say, and it costs so much per acre, and then you know you would multiply that out. We also need to know about frontage. Remember we said when we were learning about this area that the frontage is the very first number in a lot dimension. So if you get a question and they say the lot is 100 by 200, 100 feet is the frontage. And some property carries more value that way. Oceanfront, high visibility locations on a major road for like retail, that would be priced according to that, I would imagine, in lots of cases. If we talk about cubic feet, everyone, cubic feet means volume. You know, so in commercial real estate, the height or the volume of a space would be more important than what it is in residential. So in residential real estate, you and I as brokers don't measure the height of a room. We measure the area, the floor space, if you will. Unit 5, you've got 3 questions. You've got a question on deed types. So I would look at the main deed types, which would be the general warranty deed, the special warranty deed, and the quitclaim deed. The biggest difference between those 3 is the amount of guarantee. Remind yourself that the general warranty deed guarantees forever. In the deed, it even uses words like forever, for whomsoever, and whatsoever, meaning going forward and going all the way back to origin of the property. That's the general warranty deed. When you go back and review over your listing agreement and your sales contract, that's the deed that on the realtor forms that we are expecting. And so when we list a property, we're saying to the owner, we expect for you to transfer the title using a general warranty deed. It has all the guarantees, all the warranties, all the covenants and promises. That's why it makes it attractive to the buyers. The special warranty deed really is not so special. It's limited. It's limited on the warranty, which means it's limited on the time. So a special warranty deed would be used maybe in a foreclosure where the bank says, we don't want to guarantee all the way back to origin. We haven't owned the property that long. We'll guarantee it from our ownership going forward. So the guarantee, the warranty is limited. And the quitclaim deed has no guarantees. The quitclaim deed probably wouldn't be a deed that you would want to receive when you buy a house from somebody you don't know. Even if you buy a house from somebody you know, you probably don't want a quitclaim deed. That's really not the purpose. Quitclaim deeds are used to make corrections. They're used to take a name off of record, maybe change a name, maybe in a divorce situation where one of the spouses is quitclaiming over to the other spouse. And so you hear it that way sometimes. But I would remember no guarantees. However, this might sound a little confusing. If someone does transfer property with a quitclaim deed, if they own the property, you get what they own. So it doesn't mean it's a shady transaction necessarily. I wouldn't think that. But if they own the property, you get what they own. There's just no guarantee on it. They're not giving you a warranty. When we talk about deed recordation, this gets a little fuzzy gray in your reading. If you'll go back in your memory to Unit 5, when we talked about the 7 essential elements to make a deed valid, Deed recordation was not one of them. We do not record the deed to validate it. We record the deed, like you all told me a minute ago, to give notice to third parties, to protect the grantee's rights, to put it on record to prevent third-party interference. We're given constructive notice, and that's because the Connor Act says to record to protect yourself. Well, there's another reason we record, and if we review our sales contract, there is a provision in there describing the closing. And the closing is when everything, all the paperwork is finished up, the lawyer is updating the title and contacting title insurance, and the deed will be recorded. It's one of the very last things. And the deed recordation, according to the offer to purchase Form 210, is the official closing of the transaction. So it's really not concluded, fulfilled, until the deed is on record. What that means is the funds are not good until all of that is done. Remind yourself of the Good Funds Act. That was brought up in that provision under closing in your sales contract. In other words, until everything is settled and in the proper order and on record, the lawyer will record, and then they will disperse the monies to the proper vendors, seller, real estate brokers, banks, that sort of thing. And remember, I mentioned to you in class, I wouldn't give keys to a buyer until it's all finished either, because it's not concluded until the deed is recorded. So if you get asked, when does title transfer? Title transfers with the delivery and the acceptance of the deed, doesn't it? So the title transfers at the very beginning of a closing meeting. That's one of the first things that the lawyer will do. He will, if the seller is there, and we know that oftentimes in closings, sellers and buyers don't meet anymore, but as a visual, if the seller's there, they will sign it in front of a notary. And then the only reason it's being notarized is because the deed will be recorded. So remind yourself, deeds don't have to be notarized or acknowledged or witnessed to be valid. We do that for another reason, and the reason is because we want to record it. And so once the seller, grantor signs that, it's transferred over to the grantee, the buyer. Title passed right then, because most of the paperwork at that real estate closing is on the benefit of the buyer. Aren't they signing a document saying they're borrowing money against that property they just got the title to? So that would be the order of things. Title insurance. The title insurance is a requirement from the lender, everyone. If you buy a property and get financing, the lender is going to require title insurance. The title insurance protects their risk in case of later third-party interference or defects that happen to come up that were not discovered. Title insurance is a one-time expense paid at closing. Title insurance is granted to the new owner, the buyer, the grantee, after closing. They pay for it at closing, all of the paperwork is concluded, the deed and the deed of trust is recorded, and then title insurance will be issued. Title insurance is available for the owner also. So when you go to a real estate closing meeting, the attorney may have asked the buyer, do you want an owner's policy also? The owner's policy will protect the buyer forever, basically. The lender's policy will diminish after the loan is paid off, after the loan's paid off, because they won't have an interest in it anymore. Questions on Unit 5? Alrighty, Unit 6. Some of the terminology will be a test question. you would have to recognize the difference between legal non-conforming use and illegal non-conforming use. Illegal non-conforming use is when someone's using the property just any old way they want to without the right to, without their permission to, if you will, against what zoning is. In a test question, they could say that John Doe's been using his property illegally for 20 years. He's been using it for a way that's not zoned. He's been using it that way for 20 years. Now that 20 sounds like a distractor to me, because in our minds we think about 20 years and easement by prescription, adverse possession. Everyone, if they're using it illegal, it is illegal. Nothing's magically gonna happen. If zoning is changing around an area and property is being used this way, the old way, zoning's changing, usually for growth or highest and best use of the area. Oftentimes the owners who were using it in the older way will still be allowed to use it, in the old zoning way. It's called legal non-conforming. Oftentimes you'll see clue words like it's been grandfathered in. You'll see a clue word like pre-existing use. Clue word like they're still allowed to use it that way. And so think about it, if the area is going through rezoning, it doesn't make sense that you get a knock on the door from a zoning commissioner saying, well, I know you live here, but you need to start using this now for a parking lot. I mean, it sounds kind of funny, doesn't it? So the idea though is eventually the area is gonna look a different way. If you own a property and you're using it legally non-conforming, you can sell the property, and if the purchaser uses it the very same way, they can continue to use it. Now, I have read ordinances about this, and sometimes when this rezoning is happening, it may say, we want the new zoning to be effective in 8 to 10 years. So there may be some guidelines like that, but really and truly, we can't stop people from selling their property, can we? And somebody coming in and using it the very same way, they'll still be allowed to continue. If they want to do something to the property on the exterior that would require a building permit, remember building permits enforce zoning, don't they? And so it wouldn't be permitted then.
If it burns down?
It would not be able to be built back. It would have to, Jane's question is, what if that property burns down? The question really is, can they put it back the way it was? And the answer is no, because you would have to have a building permit to do that, and it would have to conform. Alrighty, other terms in zoning, we learned about spot zoning and variance and conditional use. I would remember that a variance is an exception to the zoning. A variance does, though, require hardship. Remember your example in your textbook, a family owns this lot, and the requirements for setback maybe were 30 feet from the right-of-way. And this lot owner wants to build a house, and he goes to the zoning board and says, if I build back 30 feet like the requirement, my lot drops off substantially, and I won't be able to utilize my lot. That's a hardship. And they may look at it and grant a variance, meaning they might allow this person to build a little closer to the right-of-way. If that person went ahead and built it without the permission of the zoning, without the exception, coming back and asking for forgiveness is not going to work, because that's against zoning, isn't it? You're supposed to seek the relief at the beginning. So I would remember it involves a hardship. The owner really can't use their land. Now, if it said there was an investor and he couldn't sell it for as much money as he wanted to sell it for, guys, that's not a hardship. It's just an investor wanting to make more money, and that wouldn't really be categorized as a hardship. Let's talk about restrictive or protective covenants. Remind yourself that restrictive covenants are private. It could even be in the deed for one exchange, one person. Restrictive covenants, generally, we think about a neighborhood, don't we? Maybe with the homeowners association and with restrictive covenants and bylaws. Restrictive or protective covenants are meant to maintain harmony in the neighborhood, to maintain value. So the intention of it is good. The intention is value will hopefully increase. And so the restrictive covenants could be all sorts of things, like how many animals you can have, how big of a house you must build, can you park on the street, little things like that. Remind yourself that restrictive covenants is not public, restrictive covenants is private, and restrictive covenants, if they're stricter, will overrule what the zoning says. Remind yourself, that comes up in lots of units we discuss, that the stricter of the two will rule. So we've already said it with right of survivorship and a will, didn't we? And we're saying it here with restrictive covenants and subdivision regulations or zoning and that sort of thing. We'll talk about it again in fair housing. Didn't we say if the federal fair housing and the state fair housing laws, if they clash, the stricter will overrule? And in many cases, North Carolina fair housing laws are stricter than the federal. All right. Let's go to the next section, which is units 7 and 8. Would you like to take a break? It's 10:05. All right, let's take our break and then we'll come back and do this.